9 people have climbed down into a hole in the middle of Texas and never climbed back out. Not disappeared, not lost. Drowned in the dark, less than 140 feet from the sunlight, in water so clear that from the surface you can watch it happen. For over 20 years afterward, nobody fully knew what that hole actually was, not how big it was, not how deep it went, not what shape it took once it left the range of a flashlight. It took a small group of volunteer divers working for free over 2 decades, squeezing through gaps 15 inches wide in total darkness, to even begin answering that question. And what they found underneath a public swimming hole 40 miles from Austin is stranger and more consequential than most people who have floated on that turquoise surface will ever realize. This is Jacob's Well in Wimberley, Texas, and the story of what is actually down there. It's worth saying up front that this video will not show you a monster. There are videos online right now claiming that a drone descended into Jacob's Well and captured something that left scientists speechless. Something with an unexplained trail in the sediment, something science supposedly can't explain. I went looking for the source of that story. There isn't one. No university, no research institution, no published survey backs it up. It's a script that's been copied from channel to channel, built around an expedition that never happened. I'm telling you that not to waste your time, but because what actually happened at Jacob's Well over the last 60 years doesn't need a monster attached to it. It's already one of the most quietly extraordinary and genuinely dangerous natural features in North America, and almost nobody outside of Central Texas knows the real version of it. On the surface, it looks like nothing dangerous at all. It looks like a postcard, a near-perfect circle of water about 12 feet across, set into a bed of pale limestone in the middle of Cypress Creek. The water is startlingly clear, a blue so saturated it looks artificial, and it stays a constant 68 degrees no matter what the Texas summer is doing to the air above it. People have been jumping into it from the surrounding rocks for well over a century. Families picnic beside it. Kids cannonball off the ledge. On a hot July afternoon, it looks exactly like what it appears to be, a swimming hole. What it actually is, technically, is an artesian spring, and that word matters more than it sounds like it should. An artesian spring isn't a place where water collects. It's a place where water is pushed. Beneath the Texas Hill Country sits a layered system of porous limestone called the Trinity Aquifer, soaked, with groundwater under enormous pressure. Where that pressure finds a weak point, an opening in the rock, water doesn't just seep out. It rises, forced upward from below like a hose held underwater and released. Jacob's Well is one of those openings. The 12-foot pool people swim in is only the doorway. Beneath it, the pressure that built that spring over geologic time also carved out something else, a cave. This kind of landscape is called karst, and the Texas Hill Country is one of the more dramatic examples of it in North America. Karst terrain forms wherever soluble rock, usually limestone, sits close to the surface and gets slowly dissolved by mildly acidic rainwater over enormous stretches of time. Rain falls, seeps into cracks in the limestone, and very gradually widens those cracks into channels, then tunnels, then full cave systems, all while carrying water down into the aquifer below. It's the same basic process that carved Mammoth Cave in Kentucky and the cenotes of the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Where that underground water finds enough pressure and the right kind of opening, it doesn't just sit there, it erupts upward, and you get a spring. Jacob's Well is what that process looks like at one particular, unusually clear, unusually accessible point on the map. The Tonkawa people knew this spot long before Anglo settlers arrived in the 1850s and gave it its current name, pulling from the Gospel of John, allegedly because the spring appeared to never run dry. For most of its recorded history, that reliability was the whole point. It was a landmark, a gathering place, a source of water that didn't fail even during drought. Nobody standing at the edge of it 100 years ago was thinking about what was underneath. Why would they? It looked like the bottom of a pool, not the mouth of a cave system extending, as we now know, well over a mile into the earth. The first people to really test that boundary were divers, starting in the 1960s, and the results were almost immediately fatal. The opening drops straight down about 30 feet before widening slightly, and if you're just swimming, that's as far as you'll ever need to go. But keep descending, and the shape of the passage starts to change. It narrows, it bends, it splits into what cave divers now label as 2 principal conduits, each branching further into side passages, dead ends, and one particularly notorious feature nicknamed the false chimney. A gap that looks, in low visibility, exactly like the way out. It is not the way out. Divers who followed it were not choosing a wrong turn out of carelessness. They were following the passage that the cave itself had shaped to look correct. Between 1964 and 1984, 9 people died diving into Jacob's Well. 8 men and 1 woman, according to the most careful accounting of the incidents. Some of them were inexperienced swimmers who had no business attempting a cave dive at all, drawn in by dares or the simple human urge to see how far down that impossible blue water actually went. But some of them were trained divers with the right equipment who understood exactly what a cave system like this demanded, and they still didn't come back up. It helps to understand why cave diving specifically carries a different, sharper level of risk than almost any other form of diving, open water scuba included. In open water, if something goes wrong, a diver's instinct and training both point toward the same solution. Go up. There's a surface directly above, and reaching it solves most emergencies. In an overhead environment like a flooded cave, that option simply does not exist. There is solid rock between the diver and the air, sometimes for hundreds of feet in every direction, and the only way out is back along the same path that was swum in. If silt gets kicked up off the cave floor, which happens easily in a passage that narrow, visibility can drop from perfectly clear to 0 in seconds, and it does not settle quickly. A diver who loses the guideline in that kind of blackout has, in practical terms, lost the only reliable route back to the surface. That is the specific mechanism behind most of the deaths at Jacob's Well. Not a lack of skill, but a combination of disorientation, an environment engineered by geology to produce false leads, and a cave that offers no second option once something goes wrong. One of the clearest documented cases happened on September 9, 1979. A group of divers from California had driven out to Wimberley for a night excursion. Two of them, 20-year-old Kent Maupin and his friend Mark Brasher, decided to make an early investigatory dive into the deeper sections of the cave, sections that had already claimed 4 lives in the years before them. Maupin was not a novice. He worked part-time at a dive shop and had trained as an assistant instructor. He knew, going in, exactly how many people had already died in the passage he intended to enter. He went anyway. Neither he nor Brasher came back out that night, or the next day, or the day after that. Recovery teams worked for nearly 2 weeks. Divers reported making it deep enough to see, or believe they saw, a body pinned beneath a slide of gravel that had come loose in the passage, but every attempt to actually reach and retrieve the 2 young men ran into the same wall. The cave, at that depth, was simply too narrow and too dangerous for a body recovery operation to safely continue. After 12 days, the search was called off. The decision made by the recovery teams, including a group brought in by Brown and Root for a second opinion, was that the safest and most respectful option was to leave the remains where they were and seal that section of the cave. That's not a detail from a horror script. That's the actual historical record, and it tells you something the swimming hole itself never will. This is not a myth-scale danger, exaggerated for a campfire story. It's a documented, repeated, entirely real pattern of loss, driven by a genuinely unusual piece of underwater geology. Maupin and Brashear weren't isolated. Local reporting on the well's history describes a diver's remains being recovered from the system in 1981, and further incidents, continuing on and off through the following 2 decades, contributing to a reputation repeated by outlets covering Texas outdoor recreation that named Jacob's Well among the most dangerous dive sites in the country. Some accounts drawing on local reporting rather than the confirmed 9-death county. T put the true number of lives lost even higher, since not every incident at an unmonitored rural swimming hole in the 20th century was necessarily recorded with full detail. What's consistent across every source, though, is the shape of the danger. It was never the initial 30-foot drop that killed people. It was always deeper, past the point where sunlight still reaches, in the branching, narrowing sections where a wrong turn looks identical to the right one. By the mid-1980s, local authorities had had enough. Signs went up. Public scuba diving into the cave system was banned outright, and it has remained banned ever since, with enforcement taken seriously enough that today only one organization is legally permitted to enter: the Jacob's Well Exploration Project, a small, largely volunteer group of experienced cave divers who began their work in the early 2000s, specifically to answer the question that decades of tragedy had left open. What is actually down there? How far does it go? And can it be understood well enough to stop killing people who don't understand what they're entering? Their work is the real version of the dramatic exploration that gets exaggerated in viral videos, and it deserves to be told accurately, because what these divers actually accomplished, using nothing but training, patience, and an enormous amount of risk tolerance, is more impressive than any fictional discovery could be. Underwater cave exploration follows strict, almost ritualistic safety procedures because the environment offers zero margin for improvisation. Divers lay a continuous guideline from the entrance the moment they enter, a physical rope that is the only reliable way to find your way back to the surface. Hence, silt has been kicked up and visibility has dropped to near 0. They carry multiple redundant air sources, because a single equipment failure that far from open water is not survivable without backup. They plan turnaround points based on air consumption long before they reach their physical limit S, because panic and low air are the 2 conditions most cave diving deaths have in common. And even with all of that discipline, the passages inside Jacob's Well have narrowed, in places, to gaps that measure roughly 15 inches across, forcing divers in full gear to remove tanks, push equipment ahead of themselves, and squeeze through solid rock with nothing but a guideline and training standing between them and a very bad outcome. The project itself had a slow, difficult start. Around the year 2000, members of a local rescue team began an initial effort working with a regional watershed advocacy group to map the cave and gather video of it. By 2002, that first attempt had stalled out and was abandoned, the difficulty of the environments, and outpacing the resources available to survey it. It took two divers, Jimmy Price and Jeff Chance, restarting the effort independently to get the work moving again. Their first task wasn't even diving, it was digging. Months spent physically clearing rock and gravel that had built up and blocked access to the first major restriction in the cave, just to reopen a path that earlier explorers had already found and lost again. Once they were back in, they discovered the cave didn't end where earlier reports had assumed it did. It kept going for hundreds of additional feet into limestone that no one had surveyed. Over the following several years, more divers joined the effort in stages, each bringing specialized skills needed for longer, more technical dives, gradually extending the map further into both of the cave's main passages until the survey reached the point it sits at today. Piece by piece, dive by dive, across roughly 2 decades, that small team mapped what earlier generations of swimmers, thrill seekers, and even some of the divers who died there never had the chance to fully understand. The cave consists of 2 principal conduits. The main passage runs approximately 4,500 feet from the sewers. Face opening, roughly the length of 13 football fields laid end to end, reaching a maximum depth of about 137 feet. A second, smaller passage splits off from the main one and extends roughly another 1,000 feet before it. 2 reaches limits that current techniques and equipment can't safely push past. In total, the exploration project has surveyed and documented close to 6,000 feet of passage, more than a mile of underwater cave, sitting beneath what most visitors experience as a 30-foot deep swimming hole. That gap between the 12-foot circle everyone sees and the mile of tunnel nobody does is the actual story here, and it's a real one. You do not need an invented monster or mysterious drone discovery to make that unsettling. The unsettling part is simply true. A public park that families visit every summer sits directly above a genuinely enormous, genuinely dangerous, and until relatively recently, genuinely unmapped geological structure. For most of the 20th century, nobody, expert or otherwise, actually knew how far Jacob's Well went. People built a diving reputation, a body count, and a mythology around a hole in the ground before anyone had the tools or the courage to actually chart its extent. The cave's biology adds another layer that's worth understanding on its own terms, without exaggeration. The Texas Hill Country sits above a network of aquifers, including the Trinity system that feeds Jacob's Well and the neighboring Edwards Aquifer, and both host a genuinely remarkable category of wildlife. Troglodytic species, animals that have evolved to live their entire lives in permanent underground darkness. The Texas blind salamander is the best known example. It has no eyes, because in total darkness, eyes cost energy to grow and offer nothing in return, so evolution simply removed them. It has no pigment either, for the same reason. Color is for creatures that need to be seen or need to hide from something that can see the M, and nothing down there is looking. It navigates instead by sensing water pressure changes and chemical gradients, feeling its way through a world with no light at all. These are not hypothetical or speculative creatures dreamed up for dramatic effect. They are documented, studied, federally recognized species, and their entire existence depends on aquifer systems. Like the one, Jacob's Well is a doorway into staying clean, connected, and flowing. The Texas blind salamander isn't alone down there either. Nearby spring systems fed by the same broad network of hill country aquifers support close relatives with equally narrow, equally fragile ranges, including the Barton Springs salamander and the Jollyville Plateau salamander, both found nowhere else on Earth outside a handful of Central T. Xas spring outlets. None of these animals are large. None of them are dangerous. What makes them remarkable is how specifically adapted they are to a single, narrow set of underground conditions. Constant cold water, constant darkness, a specific chemistry, and how little it would take to disrupt that. A drop in water quality, a drop in flow, a shift in temperature. Caused by reduced spring output, any of it can be enough to threaten a species that has nowhere else to go because its entire world is a few hundred feet of flooded limestone. That fragility isn't a side note to the Jacob's Well story. It's the through line connecting the cave's biology to the crisis happening in the water above it right now. Which brings us to the part of this story that isn't about the 1980s or a viral video, it's about right now. Jacob's Well has, at several points in recent history, simply stopped flowing. Since the year 2000, the spring has gone dry on 4 separate occasions, most recently during the brutally hot summer of 2022. For a spring that was named in the 1850s, specifically because it seemed like it could never run dry, that is not a small event. It is the visible, surface level symptom of a much larger and much more consequential problem happening in the rock below. The Trinity Aquifer, the pressurized groundwater system that has driven this spring for thousands of years, is under genuine stress. Population growth across central Texas has dramatically increased the rate at which ground-due hydro is pumped out of the ground for drinking water, irrigation, and development. At the same time, drought cycles, worsened by shifting climate patterns, are reducing how quickly that aquifer refills. Draw more out, put less back in, and eventually the pressure that used to force water 12 feet up through solid limestone simply isn't there anymore. This isn't an abstract concern limited to one swimming hole. The Trinity and Edwards aquifer systems underlying the Texas Hill Country provide drinking water to millions of people, including much of the city of San Antonio. Decisions about how much water can safely be withdrawn from these systems are based on hydrological models, and those models depend on understanding how the underground system actually behaves, how it's connected, where the passages run, how water moves through it. For decades, a pice sea of that system, the mile of cave beneath Jacob's Well, was essentially a blank spot on the map. It has only been properly surveyed within the last 20 years, entirely through the volunteer labor of a handful of cave DIY. Furs willing to squeeze through 15-inch gaps to collect the data by hand. That should tell you something about how much of the ground beneath fast-growing American cities remains genuinely undocumented, not because the questions aren't important, but because the answers are extraordinarily hard and dangerous to obtain. Wimberley itself sits at the center of that pressure. The town and the surrounding Hays County area have been among the fastest growing parts of Texas for years, which means more homes, more wells, more water, pulled from the same aquifer that has fed Jacob's Well for millennia. Every new well drilled upstream in the recharge zone is, in a very direct sense, competing with the spring for the same finite, slowly refilling supply. None of this is unique to Wimberley. It is the same basic equation playing out across most of the American Southwest. Population growth, increasing demand on groundwater faster than rainfall and conservation can replace it, with visible, physical consequences showing up first at the most sensitive points in the system. Like a spring that had, for its entire recorded history, been defined by never running dry, local conservation groups have taken this seriously. The Wimberley Valley Watershed Association, the nonprofit most directly responsible for advocating for the spring, has spent years working to protect the land that feeds it. In 2021, the organization purchased, specifically to protect it as part of the aquifer's recharge zone, the land where rainfall actually seeps down and replenishes the pressurized water supply below. That brought their total protected land in the recharge zone to 350 acres. It's meaningful progress, but by their own acknowledgement, it isn't close to a guarantee. The long-term fate of Jacob's Well, and of swimming holes and spring-fed creeks like it across the state, remains genuinely uncertain, tied directly to decisions being made right now about groundwater use, land development, and drought management across a region that keeps growing faster than its water supply can keep up with. So here is what's actually true about Jacob's Well, without embellishment. It is a real artesian spring feeding one of the most important aquifer systems in the American Southwest. It sits above a documented cave system stretching close to 6,000 feet, mapped only within the last 2 decades by volunteer divers risking their lives one narrow passage at a time. It has killed at least 9 people through a combination of disorienting false passages and unforgiving depth, a toll serious enough that public diving into it has been banned for roughly 40 years. It hosts a genuinely alien-looking, scientifically documented ecosystem of blind, colorless salamanders that have adapted to a world with no light at all. And it has, 4 separate times since the year 2000, simply gone dry, a warning sign written directly into the landscape about how much pressure Central Texas is putting on the water beneath its feet. None of that needed an invented monster, a mysterious 2022 drone expedition, or an unexplained trail in the sediment to be worth telling. The real version of this story is unsettling enough on its own. It's the story of how little we actually know about the ground directly beneath places we consider familiar, and how the process of finding out, whether through a diver's guideline or years of patient survey work, is slower, more dangerous, and more human than any manufactured mystery could be. There's also a quieter point buried in all of this, one that has nothing to do with caves specifically. Even today, even 137 feet down, well within reach of modern diving technology, a fair amount of Jacob's Well remains past where anyone has safely gone. The Jacob's Well exploration. Project hasn't declared the system fully explored. They've documented what current techniques, air supply, and passage width allow, and stopped where the risk stops being justifiable. The same restraint that likely would have saved several of the divers who died there decades earlier. That's not a cliffhanger inserted for effect. It's just an honest acknowledgement that mapping a cave, like mapping an aquifer, or understanding a water system that millions of people depend on, is slow, incomplete work that gets finished in small, careful steps, not in a single dramatic expedition. The next time you see a perfectly clear, perfectly blue swimming hole, remember that the surface is very rarely the whole story. Sometimes what's underneath took 2 decades and 9 lives to even begin to map, and in places, we still haven't finished. If this kind of story, the real geology, the real history, the real human cost behind a place that looks like nothing more than a postcard, is the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and let me know what hidden place you'd want covered next. I rate every one of them. And if you learned something new today, do me a favor and share this video with someone who's ever jumped into a swimming hole without thinking twice about what's underneath it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.